Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive into post-World War II America. It's a fascinating era, full of complexities and contradictions, kind of like opening a time capsule packed with booming economies and the rise of suburbia, but also, simmering social tensions. We'll be using excerpts from a history textbook chapter to unpack all of this.
You got it. And it's interesting how this period, often called the Golden Age, witnessed such a dramatic economic shift. Between 1950 and 1973, the U.S. economy just took off.
Really kick off.
Oh, yeah. Stable prices, low unemployment, and get this, real wages actually doubled. It's no wonder people felt like they were living the dream.
The American dream in full swing, huh? People had money to burn, and I bet they were snapping up all the cool new stuff hitting the market.
You bet. Cars, TVs, dishwashers, even air conditioning, things that used to be considered luxuries were becoming, well, everyday items for a growing middle class.
Makes sense. But where was everyone putting down roots? All these new families needed homes.
That's where suburbia comes in. Think Levittown, New York, rows and rows of pretty much identical houses targeted at white veterans. It became the blueprint for mass-produced, affordable housing.
And it took off, didn't it? Didn't our sources say something like, by 1960, more folks lived in the suburbs than anywhere else? Wild to imagine these sprawling communities, all those cookie-cutter houses and those perfect lawns. But was this dream accessible to everyone? You mentioned those houses were targeted at white veterans.
That's the catch. You see, government policies like the GI Bill and FHA loans, they were instrumental in fueling suburban growth, but they were also deeply discriminatory.
So black families got shut out.
Pretty much. They were systematically excluded, and practices like redlining, denying loans based on neighborhood demographics made it almost impossible for them to get mortgages in these new suburbs.
Wow, it's crazy how something that seems positive on the surface can have such a lasting impact on inequality.
Yeah.
And wasn't there a huge westward expansion happening at the same time? Millions of Americans were on the move, right?
Absolutely. Over 30 million people actually headed west of the Mississippi between World War II and 1975. California, with all that sunshine and open space, it just boomed, becoming the most populous state in '63. People were looking for opportunity, a fresh start, a chance to reinvent themselves.
Wide open spaces, the possibility of striking it rich. It must felt like a true frontier.
Uh,
This westward migration also seems to coincide with a shift in values, right? The rise of consumer culture.
Right on. The very definition of freedom was getting a makeover. It became less about, self-reliance and independence and more about buying power, the flashiest car, the biggest TV, all the trappings of the good life that advertisers were constantly pushing.
So freedom was less about what you could do and more about what you could own. That's a big shift. Was it a good thing?
That's a tough one. Historians still debate that. On the one hand, consumerism fueled economic growth and gave folks access to goods and services that made life easier. But it also came at a price, an emphasis on material possessions over, say, community, a constant desire for more, and maybe even a disconnect from, well, deeper values.
Food for thought for sure. It makes you think about how this new mindset affected family life, relationships, even people's sense of satisfaction. But let's shift gears to two other biggies of this era, TV and automobiles. By 1960, almost every American household had a TV. That's a lot of screens.
Television was a game changer. It became the source for news and entertainment, but most importantly, advertising. Advertisers realized they could use it to influence people's wants and shopping habits.
Selling the American dream right alongside soap and cereal.
Exactly. But TV did more than just sell products. Remember, this was also the era of the civil rights movement, and television brought those images right into people's living rooms.
For the first time, people saw the brutal reality of segregation and the bravery of those fighting for equality.
Absolutely. Those images of police brutality against peaceful protesters, the fire hoses, the attack dogs, it sparked a nationwide conversation about race and justice. Powerful stuff.
It is amazing how TV could be a tool for consumerism and a catalyst for social change, all at the same time. But we can't forget about the other big invention, the car. By 1960, 4 out of 5 families owned at least one.
And with the interstate highway system, long-distance road trips became a thing, and with them came motels, drive-in theaters, and of course the fast food joints like McDonald's.
The car became a symbol of freedom, right? The open road, new possibilities. It reshaped the American landscape literally. But how did it change American culture beyond just transportation? What about its impact on the environment, for example?
All valid questions. The car brought pollution, traffic jams, and the sprawl of cities.
It's a good reminder that progress often comes with trade-offs. We tend to romanticize the past. But even the most positive changes can have unintended consequences. Speaking of trade-offs, it seems like the economic boom didn't translate into equality for everyone. Women, despite their contributions during the war, often found themselves pushed back into traditional roles.
It's true. They were expected to be homemakers and mothers, and those who did work outside the home were usually stuck in low-paying, non-union jobs.
Didn't our sources mention a significant pay gap, too?
Oh, yeah, a huge one. In 1960, women earned, on average, only 60% of what men did for the same work. And popular culture just reinforced these traditional roles.
It's a stark reminder that even in prosperous times, deep-rooted inequalities can persist. And when it came to racial inequality, the picture was even bleaker. We talked about how suburbs were mostly white due to discriminatory housing policies.
Right. Practices like redlining were widespread, and it wasn't just banks. Government agencies, real estate agents, even neighborhood associations all played a part in keeping black families out of white neighborhoods.
It's chilling how systemic racism was baked into the system. And speaking of housing, what of those who couldn't afford the suburban dream, especially in cities? Public housing projects were meant to address urban poverty, weren't they?
They were, but they often became overcrowded and run down. And then you had white middle-class resistance to public housing in their neighborhoods.
It's tragic how the people these projects were supposed to help often ended up worse off. Then there's white flight, white families leaving cities for the suburbs, taking their tax dollars and resources with them.
And that left cities struggling with a growing concentration of poverty, especially in Black and Latino neighborhoods. To add insult to injury, you had real estate agents using blockbusting tactics, deliberately scaring white families into selling their homes at a loss, then profiting from the rapid turnover.
It's a cycle of exploitation, and the consequences are still felt today in the racial and economic makeup of our cities. But amidst all this, there was a religious resurgence happening too, right?
Definitely. Church membership in the 1950s hit record highs. The idea of a shared Judeo-Christian heritage was really emphasized, partly to distinguish America from godless communism and create a sense of national unity.
Interesting how religion became so intertwined with politics and national identity. And to drive that point home, under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in '54, and In God We Trust started appearing on money in '57.
Religion played a very public role then. Religious leaders were on TV, reaching millions with their messages, often mixing in anti-communist rhetoric. And this selling of America went beyond religion. There was a big push to promote free enterprise and capitalism as the American way.
It makes you wonder, with the rise of consumerism happening at the same time, were they just pushing an economic system, or were there deeper anxieties at play?
Good question. Some argue that the push for free enterprise was driven by fear of communism, a way to present capitalism as the best and only option. Others see it as a way to justify the growing inequalities, saying individual success was all about hard work, ignoring the systemic barriers many people faced.
It's a complex issue. But while America was celebrating post-war prosperity and promoting capitalism, some were starting to question the status quo.
Right. Didn't our sources talk about intellectual and political challenges emerging during this time?
They did. In the 1950s, conservative thought started to make a comeback. They felt liberalism had gone too far and that government was stifling individual liberty.
A pushback against the New Deal, then.
Exactly. And there were different flavors of conservatism brewing. You had the libertarian conservatives, like economist Milton Friedman. He championed individual freedom, limited government, and free markets.
Right, Friedman, he was a big name, right? Didn't he have some pretty radical ideas about shrinking the role of government?
Oh, yeah. His book, Capitalism and Freedom, came out in '62 and argued that the free market was the best way to protect individual freedom and promote economic prosperity. He wanted to privatize almost everything, get rid of the minimum wage, abolish the graduated income tax, even do away with Social Security. Whoa, those are some bold proposals. But it sounds like he was tapping into a growing feeling that the government had become too powerful and was meddling too much.
You got it. And alongside the libertarian side, a new social conservatism was emerging too, focused on traditional Christian family values and pushing back against what they saw as big government interfering in people's lives.
So they were concerned about things like the changing role of women, the increasing secularization of society, and the perceived decline of traditional morals.
Exactly. They felt that liberalism was eroding the moral fabric of America and that returning to traditional values was the only way to restore the nation's greatness. And with this rising tide of conservatism, the stage was set for a big shift in American politics. Enter Dwight D. Eisenhower, better known as Ike, a war hero who jumped into the political arena in 1952.
Ike. He was a national icon after leading the Allied forces to victory in World War II. He was so popular, both Democrats and Republicans wanted him as their candidate.
He ended up running as a Republican with Richard Nixon, a young and ambitious up-and-comer, as his running mate. Nixon really appealed to the, quote, forgotten man, the average guy supposedly burdened by taxes and government red tape.
So they positioned themselves as champions of the everyday American. But Eisenhower himself, wasn't he more of a moderate?
He was more of a pragmatist than an ideologue. He believed in finding common ground.
So despite his conservative image, he didn't dismantle the New Deal, as some expected. He went with modern republicanism and actually expanded some social programs.
Yep. He was more about managing and tweaking the New Deal than scrapping it all together. This basically made the New Deal a permanent part of American life, no matter who was in charge.
It's fascinating how he navigated the political landscape. But what about labor and management? Wasn't there a new social contract developing during his presidency?
There was. Unions, in exchange for better wages and benefits like pensions and health insurance, agreed to let management handle production and investment decisions. This helped keep things peaceful on the labor front and contributed to that economic growth we talked about.
Sounds like everyone won. But we can't forget the elephant in the room, the Cold War. America might have been enjoying peace and prosperity, but the threat of nuclear war loomed large.
Absolutely. Cold War tensions kept escalating throughout the 1950s. In 52, the U.S. developed the hydrogen bomb, way more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The Soviets followed suit a year later. Both sides started stockpiling these devastating weapons.
That's a scary thought. How did the U.S. respond to this growing threat?
In 54, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, came up with a massive retaliation doctrine. Any Soviet attack on a U.S. ally would be met with a full-on nuclear strike against the Soviet Union itself.
That sounds incredibly risky. Was there no other option?
The idea was that the threat of total annihilation would keep the Soviets from ever attacking. It was a precarious balance of power called mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. The reality was that any nuclear exchange would probably mean the end of the world.
So the threat of total destruction was the only thing keeping the peace. That's a chilling thought. But Eisenhower still believed diplomacy was possible, didn't he?
He did. He saw the Soviets as rational and believed in dialogue. In 55, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev called for peaceful coexistence with the U.S. He even visited the U.S. in 59 and met with Eisenhower. There was a glimmer of hope for a less hostile relationship.
So things were looking up.
There were some optimistic moments, but the tension was still there. Then, in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth.
That must have shaken things up in the U.S.
Oh, it did. Sputnik launched the space race, a competition between the U.S. and the USSR for technological dominance. It also fueled worries about a missile gap, with Americans fearing the Soviets could now launch nukes from space.
It seems like this Cold War rivalry was everywhere, from science and tech to politics and culture.
It was. And it wasn't just about the U.S. and the USSR. Our sources also talk about the rise of the Third World during this time.
The Third World. What exactly did that refer to?
It was a term for the newly independent nations in Asia and Africa that weren't aligned with either the U.S. or the USSR. Many of these countries had just broken free from European colonial rule. They wanted to find their own path, often leaning towards socialist or non-aligned views.
So they wanted to chart their own course, independent of the superpowers. Did the U.S. respect that neutrality?
Not always. The U.S. was afraid of communism spreading in these new nations and often got involved, sometimes supporting authoritarian regimes over democratically elected leaders if it meant stopping communism.
A reminder that the Cold War wasn't just about politics, it was about ideology, too.
Exactly. The U.S. saw the world through a containment lens. Any communist gain was seen as a threat to their interests and security.
And that fear led to actions that often undermined democracy and self-determination in other countries. Any examples?
Guatemala and Iran are two prime examples. Both had democratically elected leaders who pursued policies that the U.S. saw as a threat. They were labeled communists and overthrown in coups supported by the CIA.
Wow. So the U.S. was willing to intervene in other countries to stop communism, even if it meant backing undemocratic regimes.
It happened a lot, unfortunately, and those interventions had lasting consequences, destabilizing regions and creating resentment towards the U.S.
It's a complicated picture of America's role in the world during this period.
It is. History is rarely simple. While promoting freedom and democracy abroad, the U.S. was also taking actions that contradicted those very ideals. But even as the Cold War raged on, cracks were starting to show in American society itself. Didn't our sources talk about a growing sense of dissent, especially among young people?
They did. The 1950s are often portrayed as an era of conformity, but there were signs of rebellion brewing beneath the surface. What were some of the ways this dissent manifested?
Well, you had the rise of rock and roll music, with its driving beats and rebellious lyrics, which really shook up conservative America. Teenagers embraced this new music, the fashion, the attitude, as a way to rebel against their parents' generation, and what they saw as a stifling conformity.
Music and fashion, powerful symbols of rebellion.
Definitely. And in places like New York and San Francisco, you had the Beats, writers and artists who rejected mainstream culture, embracing nonconformity, artistic expression, and spiritual exploration.
The Beats, the precursors to the 1960s counterculture movement, right? Challenging materialism, militarism, and social norms.
You got it. Their writings and ideas really paved the way for the social and cultural upheavals of the next decade.
Sounds like the seeds of rebellion were being sown in different parts of American society.
They were, and perhaps the most significant rebellion of this era was a civil rights movement, a direct challenge to America's racial hierarchy.
A perfect transition to the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot, from economic booms to suburban life, Cold War anxieties to the stirrings of discontent. But the fight for racial equality deserves its own chapter.
It does. Picking up where we left off, the seeds of rebellion you talked about really took root. And no rebellion shook things up quite like the civil rights movement. The fight for racial equality had been going on for a long time, but this era marked a real turning point.
Absolutely. It's like all the threads we've been unraveling, the economic shifts, those Cold War anxieties, the exposure of all that hypocrisy, they all came together to create this.
Perfect storm for change.
Yeah. And our sources pointed to the NAACP's legal strategy, spearheaded by Thurgood Marshall, as a major catalyst. They took aim at that separate but equal doctrine that had been the law of the land ever since Plessy v. Ferguson back in 1896.
It was a long game, a meticulously planned legal battle. The NAACP focused on proving that separate facilities for Black Americans were anything but equal.
They chipped away at it piece by piece.
Exactly, starting with higher education. And all their efforts culminated in Brown v. Board of Education, that landmark case.
That case is legendary. 1952, the Supreme Court agrees to hear Brown v. Board of Education, actually a combination of 5 different lawsuits, all challenging school segregation from different parts of the country. And leading the charge, Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first Black Supreme Court justice. He argued that segregation was deeply harmful to Black children, impacting their self-esteem, their opportunities.
And on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court hands down a unanimous decision. Segregation in public education is unconstitutional, a monumental victory, overturning decades of precedent and striking a major blow against Jim Crow.
It must felt like the earth was shifting. But we know legal victories don't always translate into immediate change on the ground. Did the South just accept this ruling?
It's not a chance. The Brown decision was met with fierce resistance, especially across the South. Many white Americans were deeply committed to segregation, and they weren't about to go down without a fight.
It's hard to fathom how entrenched those racist attitudes were. But before we dive into the backlash, our sources mention several factors that fueled the rise of the civil rights movement in the first place. Can you unpack those a bit?
Absolutely. World War II had a huge impact. Black Americans fought bravely for their country, only to come home to a system that denied them their basic rights.
The hypocrisy is staggering.
Exactly. It fueled a sense of outrage, a determination to fight for change. The post-war economic boom also played a role. Black Americans still faced huge barriers, but the expanding economy opened up some opportunities. It led to a growing Black middle class, folks with the resources and the education to organize and lead the movement.
So economic empowerment helped pave the way for social change. People need a certain level of stability to challenge the status quo, right?
Absolutely. And the GI Bill had a big impact, providing educational benefits to veterans. It allowed many Black men to attend college, gain new skills, and become leaders in the movement.
It's like the government inadvertently helped create the very force that would challenge its own discriminatory policies. What about the role of media? Did that help amplify the movement?
Huge impact. Television was a game changer. For the first time, the brutality of segregation was being broadcast into American homes.
People were seeing it with their own eyes.
Exactly. It was a wake-up call for many white Americans who'd been sheltered from the realities of racial violence and discrimination. And then you have the horrific murder of Emmett Till in 1955.
That story is just tragic. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago,
Yeah.
brutally murdered in Mississippi for supposedly whistling at a white woman.
The brutality of his murder and then the acquittal of his killers by an all-white jury sparked outrage and protests across the country.
It's a chilling reminder of how deeply ingrained racial hatred was. Did this case have a direct impact on the movement?
Many historians see Till's death as a turning point. It galvanized Black communities, inspired a new generation of activists demanding justice and equality.
This horrific act of violence became a rallying cry.
Yes. And speaking of turning points, our sources focus on the Montgomery bus boycott. Many see this as the start of the mass phase of the civil rights movement.
December 1955, Rosa Parks, a black seamstress and activist, refuses to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest sparks a year-long boycott of the city's buses by the black community.
It was a powerful display of unity and resistance. They organized carpools, walked miles to work, endured hardship and harassment, all to make their voices heard.
Rosa Parks' defiance is such an iconic moment. It took incredible courage to make that stand, knowing what she might face. And this boycott brought a young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. to the forefront of the movement.
Dr. King, a gifted speaker with a deep commitment to nonviolence, emerged as a leader of the boycott. He urged Black Americans to confront injustice with love and dignity, a message that resonated across the country.
His philosophy of nonviolent resistance, rooted in his Christian faith, was inspired by Gandhi's success in India. Meeting hate with love, violence with peace, injustice with a commitment to truth. Such a powerful concept.
The Montgomery bus boycott under Dr. King's leadership became a model for future protests. It proved that nonviolent direct action could be a powerful tool for change.
It inspired similar actions across the South, and in November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional.
A major victory for the movement. But it also fueled a backlash from white Southerners who were determined to hold on to their system of racial hierarchy.
Every step forward was met with resistance, a constant push and pull between those fighting for change and those clinging to the old ways. Our sources talked about massive resistance in the South, a deliberate effort to defy Brown and keep segregation alive.
Absolutely. 1956, 82 out of 106 Southern congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto, denouncing Brown as judicial overreach. Some school districts closed their schools rather than integrate. States like Georgia and South Carolina even added Confederate symbols to their flags as acts of defiance.
Wow. It's incredible how far they were willing to go to preserve a system built on racism and inequality. Did President Eisenhower do anything to enforce the Brown decision?
Eisenhower hesitated to get involved, believing change would come gradually. But the escalating violence and defiance forced his hand. In 1957, when the governor of Arkansas used the National Guard to stop the court-ordered integration of Little Rock Central High, Eisenhower had to act.
He sent federal troops to make sure the Little Rock Nine, the 9 black students who bravely volunteered to integrate, could attend classes safely.
It was a dramatic showdown, and the whole nation was watching.
It must have been terrifying for those 9 students. They were incredibly brave. That image, federal troops escorting those students to school, became symbolic of the government's commitment to desegregation.
Absolutely. Little Rock was pivotal, demonstrating that the federal government was finally willing to use its power to protect Black citizens. But the battle wasn't over. The movement was entering a new phase, one marked by progress and setbacks, and a growing sense of urgency.
Sounds like we're about to delve into a whole new chapter. The stakes are getting higher, and the fight for equality is about to reach a boiling point.
That's right. The next chapter of the civil rights movement will take us through some of the most dramatic and transformative years in American history.
It's going to be intense. What a journey through this crucial time in American history. We saw the post-war years, the progress and the conflict, the Cold War shaping the world, and the struggle for civil rights transforming America.
It shows that history is alive, something we carry with us. And as we deal with today's complexities and look to the future, we can learn from the past, letting it guide us and motivate us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Hope it's made you curious, challenged your views, and maybe even inspired you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better world.